Welcome to the first McCusker Centre for Citizenship panel event for Semester 2, Active Citizenship in Context, Disability Advocacy, Empowerment and Respect. My name is Natalie and I'll be moderating the discussion for today. I'd just like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on the traditional country of the Noongar people and pay respect to elders past and present. I recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, which continue to be important to the Noongar people living today. So today's event aims to provide an overview of disability in Australia, including issues central to life with a disability and the role of disability advocates. During the final 10 to 15 minutes of the discussion, we'll be having an audience Q&A, so feel free to submit your questions via slido.com. So just using the QR code, if you scan that with your phone now, that'll connect to the website and you can just put in your questions as you have them. So just feel free to put those questions in at any point during the conversation and we'll address them at the end of the panel event. So I'd just like to start off by introducing our panellists for today. So we're incredibly lucky to be joined online by the Federal Disability Discrimination Commissioner, Dr. Ben Gauntlet. Dr. Gauntlet commenced his 5-year term as Disability Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission in 2019. Prior to commencing this role, Ben worked as a barrister in Western Australia and Victoria with a broad-ranging practice. He's also worked as an associate at the High Court of Australia, as counsel assisting the Solicitor General of the Commonwealth, a solicitor for a large commercial law firm, and has taught law in Australia and the UK. As if that wasn't enough, Ben studied at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. As Disability Discrimination Commissioner, Ben advocates to remove barriers to people with disability participating in society and to ensure the human rights of people with disabilities are respected. Our second speaker for today is Liz Sullivan. Liz is an accessibility advisor at the University of Western Australia, where she manages a multidisciplinary team of accessibility advisors. Liz has over 19 years of experience in the tertiary education disability field in both a university and vocational setting. She is a strongly committed disability practitioner advocate dedicated to the promotion of equity, access and learning for all. Our third and final speaker for today is Kate Swann. Kate is an experienced social worker who currently works as a specialist support coordinator at ARC Support Coordination. Kate has extensive experience working with people with disabilities across a variety of roles and in dealing with the NDIS system to obtain optimal support packages for those that she works with. So we might kick over to Dr. Gauntlet. Would you be able to start us off by just giving a bit of an outline of your background, your role as Disability Discrimination Commissioner and the role of the office in advocating for people with disabilities?
Sure. Can I just test that you can hear me okay?
Good. Yep.
And see me okay?
Perfect.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's always nice to be in Perth, even remotely. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which I'm presenting to you today, though, from, which is Gadigal land of the Eora Nation in Sydney. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the audience today. In terms of introducing myself, the role of Disability Discrimination Commissioner and disability in Australia more generally, I think it's probably best to take a little bit of a step back just in terms of disability rights in Australia and consider where we've come from and where we're going to get to, and perhaps how I sit within that framework. For a long time across the world, there was some really serious issues in relation to people with disabilities being seen as equals. In Australia, the Human Rights Commission was started in the 1980s, but it wasn't until 1992 that the Disability Discrimination Act was actually enacted into law. And what that Act provides for is that in particular settings, people with disability are protected from discrimination, which can be of two forms. One is direct discrimination, where a person is directly discriminated against because they're treated unequally, but also indirect discrimination, where a person may be treated equally but the outcome is different because of that individual's disability. And there is a requirement within the Disability Discrimination Act to accord reasonable adjustments for people to ensure that they're treated as equals. In time, what has occurred is that in transport, education and relation, and also premises, standards have been created under that Act to try and clarify what are the obligations on institutions relating to people with disability in Australia. But the Disability Discrimination Act is a small part of a much broader framework of laws which impact on people with disability. And in 2010, the disability community came together and created a report which was called the Shutout Report. And what the Shutout Report suggested was that there was a real need for an overarching framework relating to people with disability in Australia. In part, the Shutout Report was precursor to a lot of things such as the National Disability Insurance Scheme. But what it actually was developed from was that in 2008, 2007 and 2008, Australia signed and ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which recognised the human rights of individuals with disabilities in Australia and across the world. Now, the Shutout Report led to what's now known as the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is designed to look after approximately 10 to 15% of the 4.4 million Australians who live with disability in Australia. But at the same time as the Shutout Report was created, there was a policy framework created called the National Disability Strategy, which looks at Commonwealth, state, territory and local government responsibilities relating to people with disability. That was a decade-long policy which was reformulated to be called Australia's Disability Strategy, which runs from 2021 to 2031. Now, when people think of disability, they often think of people who use mobility aids. But what we actually know is that over 80% of disability is invisible in nature. A considerable amount of disability is episodic in nature, and that the vast majority, over 80% of disability, is acquired during the totality of someone's life. And so there are 4.4 million Australians at any one time living with disability, but it's estimated that we'll all spend approximately at least 21% of our lives living with disability. And that 20% of households in Australia have a person with disability living in it. So when we discuss sort of disability and its interactions with society, one of the things I always like to say to people is good disability policy benefits everyone, because often everyone is affected by the policy, whether they presently have a disability or they will in the future, or one of their friends or family members will. Now, my background is I actually went to UWA. I often tell the law school and the dean there that I bleed purple, being a lover of UWA from my time there. I am a wheelchair user as a result of a spinal cord injury when I was 16, playing rugby union. I went to John 23rd, and after going to hospital, I actually went into medical school after finishing school, but because of my hand function and a few other things, decided to change into law, the degree I never wanted to do, which is perhaps the law school's worst nightmare when they invite me out to give a presentation. When I started off with, this is the degree I never wanted to do. But it was a fabulous degree where I got on with people, and I was able to travel the world as a result. Now, through circumstances, I drifted into becoming a barrister, but I was asked to become Disability Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission. Now, the Disability Discrimination Commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission has a policy role. What they seek to do is to create policies within the frameworks that exist at a Commonwealth level to ensure, above all, that people with disability are treated as equals. That includes, but it's not limited to, employment, education, access to buildings, healthcare and things of that nature. It includes advocating in relation to the National Disability Insurance Scheme to make sure it's fit for purpose and looks after all individuals. One of the things I like to tell people is that the Australian Human Rights Commission's most important role, though, is perhaps shining the brightest light into the darkest places. Because sometimes people with disability in the community can have very, very unfortunate outcomes and live in some incredibly challenging life circumstances, and someone has to raise issues that this has to be done differently. That can sometimes include individuals who have had lives which are not lives that we aspire to, such as people in the justice system or people who have been put in long-term health arrangements relating to needing to be deemed fit to plead. And so what the Disability Discrimination Commissioner has to do is to try and get government to balance the human rights of individuals with a need for society to function in a way that's informed by economic principles, but also understands the importance of diversity and inclusion. It's a great job. The best bit of the job is meeting people. So sadly, I'm not there in person. But one of the other aspects of the job, which is great, is we get interns. So Mitchell was kind enough to invite me to come to this seminar. So I'm delighted to be here, but I might leave it there and let the other speakers speak. But the role is very much a policy role, and what we're trying to do is something that we're doing today is to advocate, empower and to make sure that everyone understands the importance of mutual respect.
Thanks so much, Ben. That's a fantastic introduction and giving some context to everyone before we kick off into the discussion today. So we might just pass over to Kate and Liz then. So let's start off with just what do we really mean when we talk about disability, and what does disability advocacy mean in the context of your organisation and role? So we might go to Kate first, if you'll kick us off.
Thank you, Ben. That was an awesome introduction. I think I'm just kind of going to go nowhere good a job as Ben, but touch upon something you mentioned, and that's about the scope of disability and what that means in our community, in WA and nationally. I think really we need to, shine the light in dark places and think about the people with so much complexity in their lives that there's a massive crossover with psychosocial disability. That's something my caseload at work tends to be, probably half of my caseload is people with mental health issues, and I think it's really important that people understand that temporary or permanent mental health issues, as they hit their environmental barriers in our society, that is a psychosocial disability. And if I can be brave and say that there are occasions when we are in meetings with NDIS planners where you feel that they almost need persuading that that is the case. So yeah, I think it's really important we widen our eyes to what is disability. And as Ben said too, you know, at one point in our lives, it's likely, I think it's 1 in 4 might have a mental health issue. So this is very much far away from the person in a wheelchair. You know, it's huge, it's very wide ranging, and it cuts across lots of different sectors. So a person might have a disability, a psychosocial disability, and mental health issues, and be struggling with poverty, and be struggling with intergenerational or family trauma. There could be cultural barriers on top of that. They could have English as a second language on top of that. There's a plethora of issues that cut across into disability, and how disenfranchised that person becomes from support, from help, and from equity.
Yes.
Mine hasn't got a red light. Does that mean it's on? Very professional start. So our team at Uni Access here at the uni, we have the real privilege to work with students to enable together some strategies so that they can succeed in education. What we're actually doing is making adjustments to create some flexibility around their course so that the impact of their disability or their health condition can lessen and that they can succeed in studies. again, we're looking at, so when you tick a box when you enrol to say, do you have a health condition or disability, that's sitting at the moment at around 2,500. At the beginning of January 1, we always go to zero and start count. The students that are linked in with us this year, we're up to about 1,700. Around 1,000 is mental health. Then a huge big chunk is neurodiverse, ADHD. And then there's the other groups of vision and hearing and mobility. Certainly, as the NDIS scheme is starting to succeed here in WA, because we're a little bit behind the rest of the states, we're now starting to see students that haven't been able to access university starting to come. It's a slow trickle, but they're starting to make inquiries, they're starting to look at accommodation over at the colleges, and we will hopefully see more and more diverse students come onto campus as that NDIS system starts to blossom more.
Thanks so much to you both. So for the next question, we're kind of wanting to look at what is it that you wish people better understood about disability, and what are some of the misconceptions that you think are commonly held about living with a disability, and how do we best address those misconceptions? So Ben, we might hand over to you if you'd like to start this one off.
But start with the second aspect of what you asked in terms of what are commonly the misconceptions about disability. I think people often think about disability that the person just has a negative life, and they have quite low expectations in relation to the quality of that person's life because the person has disability. And what we really want to do is to change those expectations concerning disability, and to appreciate that disability is an aspect of humanity, and it's just an aspect of who a person is, much like a person's gender or race or ethnicity, so too is disability an aspect of a person's life. And I think that misconception concerning people with disability and how we wish to sort of change what we do in relation to disability is what I hope that people understand about disability is that a person's expectations, or the expectations relating to that person, should still be high, and that the individual should be treated, as we all should be, with dignity and respect. But within that discussion about the expectations and the treatment of people with disability, I think it's really important to understand that the person you're speaking to, that person you're dealing with, you don't always know what's happened in their life. They may have a disability, they may not. But one of the important aspects of appreciating the importance of diversity and inclusion, including disability within that, is that when we treat people with dignity and respect, we take into account such things as disability, we're all better off. And those high expectations that we apply to people as we treat them as we find them is a really important aspect. So I think when I say, what do I hope that people understand about disability? It's that people with disability are diverse, and that disability itself is diverse too. But that also that when we look at the misconceptions in relation to how best to address it, I think we have to have high expectations of people with disability, to communicate with them, and to also, for people with disability, particularly young people with disability, to have a sense of pride that people do and will be dignified, respectful and understanding, in part often because they may have a disability themselves, but also they may have a family member with a disability, and they will go out of their way to ensure that people are treated with dignity and respect.
Fantastic, thanks so much, Ben. Liz, we might hand back over to you to...
Definitely students that I've worked with who have long-term disability, it's their strength, and they actually need very little assistance. They It's also that thing about they're not amazing because they have a disability, but it is who they are. It is a part of their identity and their entity, and students that have had a lifelong disability need very little assistance to succeed at university. Students with a new diagnosis may need more flexibility and support, and that's probably more where those support services step in around those students that are adjusting to a new diagnosis.
Too many microphones now.
That's a really broad question. It's kind of hard to answer. I think maybe I can touch a little bit on permanency of disability. So, of course, every human deserves to have high aspirations, hopes, dreams, and in the words of the NDIS, choice and control. I would like to mention that sometimes the kind of extreme version of that can actually be detrimental, in that there are certain participants of the NDIS I've worked with. The agency, the NDIS, kind of allude to the fact that this will heal, that the treatment-resistant schizophrenia will heal. With recovery coaching, you will heal and get better, and then you will find a job. We'll give you finding and keeping a job fund, and then 2 years you won't need an NDIS plan, and we'll all save loads of money. So to be mindful that, of course, aspirations are raised high, that we have equity, that we empower people with disabilities that don't feel empowered, but that also people with lifelong disabilities, even terminal illnesses, cognitive decline like Huntington's disease or Parkinson's, you know, if they're under 65, they're not in aged care, they're within the National Disability Insurance Scheme system, and often they are expected to go out and find a job at some point. That's not going to happen. So just being realistic about those things, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So I guess we've kind of touched on a few of the barriers that face people with disabilities in terms of being approached with people having mindsets that don't necessarily accord to their situation, and NDIS, of course, poses a big challenge in some circumstances. But were there any kind of other structural barriers that kind of come to mind that are faced by people with disabilities in Australia, and what can we do to start trying to overcome these barriers? Ben, we'll go first to you again.
Sure. I probably just have to, in advance, just say, though, I unfortunately do have to leave in about half an hour just to get to another meeting, which I apologise for. I think when we think about structural barriers for people with disability, it's really important to just consider the whole of a person's life. And by that, what I mean is we all need somewhere to live. We need to often get public transport or some form of transport to access, whether it be education or employment. We need to communicate, things of those nature. And unfortunately, when we think of things like accommodation, when we think of transport, we think of procedures that might relate to enrolment, etc. There are structural barriers because universal design is not done well in Australia. And so people can be frozen out by that. And that includes electronic access. So a person with low vision or a person who has a cognitive or intellectual disability may not be able to use an iPhone like other people do, or a phone to access things, and that excludes them as well. And so the structural barriers often relate about design only being in place for sort of 90% of the population or 80% of the population, and those people that do not come within that are then excluded. And what we need to do is to very much be very open about the importance of universal design. That's not just in relation to the built environment, it's the electronic environment, it's how we communicate, it's how we make offerings to people to be included. And so the biggest structural barrier is that lack of design or lack of inclusion of people with disability. But then within that, there's also a community attitudes piece that we need to teach and educate to overcome such things as unconscious bias, to ensure that when we create programs, that the person who's creating the program does so with an understanding of disability, and hopefully will talk to people with disability in relation to the design of the program to ensure that people with disability are included.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Liz, you kind of touched on earlier that you're seeing an increase in enrolment in university of students who are living with disabilities, and that people are entering, campus accommodation more often as well. So was there kind of some structural barriers around that are gradually being lifted, do you think, and which are becoming more accessible to people, and people kind of becoming more aware of this?
As Ben mentioned before, we are under the disability legislation, Disability Discrimination Act, Disability Standards for Education. Uni Access is quoting them all the time, but pretty much that's where we work. We work by stating those kind of legislations and policy. And we're moving into an area where that's just known, and the argument isn't really there anymore, and we're stepping into talking about universal design for education. So although there's universal design for buildings, universal design for the internet, things like that, we're now walking into the land of, well, how is your assessment structured? Is it got a universal design flavour to it? So I think it's really lovely to see that we're moving past the big stick of legislation into how we can actually drop those barriers down. But when I saw that question about barriers, one of the things I did want to say was just the social network at university. Social networks at university are really hard to crack. We all just want to be in a friendly, inclusive environment, and that's your goal while you're at uni. Get your degree and make some lifelong friends. And I'd encourage you, as for something that you could actually do really easily, is to let someone with some difference into your social network, because that's the barrier that's really hard, is that social inclusion. So a student with a disability may be here for 4 years or longer and have never cracked that social network barrier, that ability to be welcomed into a social network, to create that lifelong friends. And it's that area that, I don't know, fear of difference, things like that. But maybe next time you're making a group project where you've got to select people, maybe if you can bring in the person that's always on the periphery. Let's start working at those hidden, untalked about areas, because we're starting to look at some really good ways of getting barriers down, but that social network one, that's not in legislation, that's the people power that we still need to crack that one.
Thanks, Liz. Kate, did you want to add on to this one?
Yeah, sorry, mine all tend to be very NDIS specific. That's the danger of my job. I think the structural barrier for me that I think needs much redress is access to disability services, access to equity, and that comes a lot of the time with diagnosis. So if someone is outside of the education system and not involved with Centrelink, I don't know how people get a psychiatric diagnosis or a neurologist to diagnose something. Without that paperwork and diagnosis, there's nothing to take to, I'm not sure about your department, but an equity department or the NDIS to say, hey, knock on the door, can you help me here? Like, this is my disability, it's been assessed, this isn't fair, I am struggling with this, that and the other issue. So that is a real barrier. Another case in point is one of our colleagues has gone recently to Kununurra in the Northern Territory, where there are lots of different Aboriginal peoples and lots of different language groups in that part of Australia that for cultural reasons, for lingual reasons, for many, many reasons, and the mistrust of the welfare state, have disability, but really won't come and knock on that door and say, hey, this isn't fair, I can't access this, I can't access the other like the next person. So that's a real barrier. And I know that there are some state initiatives looking into that. But there are some good initiatives, actually. Sorry, you were saying, is there any like success being made? And now there are links between the hospital system, the tertiary hospital system, and the NDIS. So we now have HLOs, health liaison officers. So those that are in hospital for the likes of Greylands with quite substantial psychosocial disability, mental health issues, now they have that link. They have that kind of backdoor into the NDIS. So there is hope. I'd like to think more links would come into play with justice, health, lots of those cross sections. Where
do you think that push needs to be coming from? Is that coming from, Ben? You're talking about... I mean, Liz was talking earlier about, legislation is the big stick, that we're now moving down a little bit down to changing just the way we act. But who needs to be? Is it just everyone needs to be more aware?
Yeah, if disability affects us all, if 1 in 4 of us are going to have a disability at some point in our lives, then it's us, right? And it comes down to the very practical, real, everyday stuff that we do all the time. Social media, having an opinion on things, learning about disability, being open-minded about it. It's the little things that make the big difference.
Particularly, I guess, if we're going back to those, like you were saying, invisible disabilities, it isn't just somebody who looks a certain stereotypical way, then Absolutely. It becomes very much events like this. So thank you all for coming. So moving on to our next question, just in the interest of time, we've kind of seen, I think, a little bit in the news recently and on social media, or potentially I have, and the other people I've spoken to, the use of language surrounding people with disabilities. The things that come to mind are Lizzo and Beyonce recently releasing songs that had slurs that were considered to be ableist, and the backlash that these songs received from the community and from disability advocates. What kind of role do you think that language has to play in tackling disability discrimination, and how do we kind of authentically share the voices of people with disabilities without reducing them to stories of inspiration for the benefit of non-disabled people? Ben, if you want to take this one first.
I probably disclose that I'm not particularly hip or cool, so when you refer to artists, I have to concede a little bit of that I had to read up on who the artists were. But, that's maybe reflecting of some smoky silver in my hair and age. But in terms of, if we just sort of take the issues of language matters. How you describe someone or how you describe yourself matters. It matters for people with disability. It matters for such things as gender. Words, whether written or spoken, can do enormous damage to an individual. And so we do have to be really open about the importance of language and communication. We also have to be we also have to be really cognizant of the dangers of objectifying someone to tell a story about them which is, in a sense, not how they wish to be conveyed or how they wish to represent themselves. And one of the reasons why it's incredibly important that we regard disability as part of the human condition, but also that we acknowledge the breadth of disability, its diversity, and that people with disability are diverse and that disability is diverse too, is to try and ensure that we don't objectify the individuals who want to identify as having a disability. Not everyone wants to identify as having a disability, and that's perfectly okay. It is absolutely okay for a person to identify as they see fit. They may only identify in certain situations. They may need to feel safe before they identify. in my workplace, I recall having a person who'd worked with me for 3 years before they identified as having a disability to me. And I would hope that in the Australian Human Rights Commission, we are a model employer. And so I think language and also an appreciation of the diverse nature of disability goes a long way to ensuring that people with disability are treated with dignity and respect, and that we don't objectify them to explain difference, but we look at difference as part of the human condition.
Awesome, thanks Ben. Kate, did you want to take this one next?
I'm going to kind of speak about this. I'm going to basically relay a conversation to you that I had with Kim Moore. So Kim's one of the managers at ARC, and she is visually more disabled than I am and has lots of personal experience with her children and her family with disability too. And she was talking about, we both agreed, you know, Beyonce and Lizzo, like, what are they doing? You know, like, they're songwriters. They're both black women, like being woman and being non-white. You would think they would be like eyes open to discrimination. Well, you know. And how many words are there? They're both lyricists. Why have they picked those words to? It's extremely disappointing. And then, oh, sorry, I'm skipping to the next question. Are we talking about this one? Or
Yes,
this
yes.
one?
Yeah.
Okay, so we were talking about Stella Young. There's a very, really intelligent, hilarious woman, comedian and thinker. She talked about inspo porn, and that as a person with disability, and Kim very much felt the same, she didn't want to be inspo porn for people. And there's comments that often we make in our everyday, like, she gets comments as she's getting out of her mobility vehicle into her chair, like, oh, I don't know how you do it. She's like, well, I don't have a choice. Of course I do it, you know. So just thinking about that, we're just clumsy with our speech, and language really does matter. Yeah, I was a big Beyonce fan, but you can go off people, can't you?
Okay. Basically, my little notes were saying that inclusive language reduces difference for all equity groups. And that's just really the way we need to think whenever we speak now, no matter what environment we're in. Because disability isn't a word that needs to be, nobody's embarrassed about the word. It's not a word you're not able to use. There's a book called Student's Manifesto. It's written by a student with a vision disability. And he's writing about one of the chapters in his book is saying that all these able words are to make people without disability feel more comfortable to talk to the person with disability. So we just need to let that language develop from that equity group, is my feeling, and let them lead that language development. But we can be inclusive no matter how we speak and whether who we're speaking with. And I think we let that language develop from that equity group rather than impose a new set of words that feel very enabling and encompassing everybody. Let's let that one grow from the group themselves rather than the advocates and the rest of the community.
And so what about situations where you have somebody who doesn't have much exposure to people with disabilities, or, you know, they don't know people around them who have identified as having a disability? Do you wait until they mess up and say something that is wrong before there's that learning opportunity, or what stage is it that this kind of education moment happens? Or
so normally the person, say with the say you blunder and make a mistake, the person with the disability will probably correct you. You say sorry and you move on. It's not about you. You maybe made that mistake, but it's not about you. So you just move the conversation on and learn through that process. You can't make it all about you. It needs to be led by the person that you're communicating with. You probably have much more experience in this area.
No, yes, that's right.
So then moving on to our last scheduled question for today, how can individuals in the community better support those living with a disability? I guess we've kind of touched on this in the last few questions that we've spoken about, in not going into situations with a preconceived idea of what disability looks like, or not using language that ostracises people, and making an effort to make people feel included in situations where they might feel excluded by difference. And how can we specifically as students be allies and supporters to the disabled community? Ben, we'll go to you first again.
How can individuals in the community better support those living with a disability? Well, obviously there's the attitudinal piece, there's the language, there's the trying to be open to ensure that people are included. That can be as simple as when you decide where to go out at night, you go somewhere where you know your friend can go. That may be not just about physical access, it might be the lighting of the venue or something like that, or the noise. Or when you go to a movies, you make sure it's captioned in terms of that individual who needs captioning. You just ask the extra question to make sure people feel comfortable. But at the moment, there's a really big need in Australia for people to work in disability support as well. And so for those people who are looking for a job, who want to provide a lot of help to the country, we actually need almost 100,000 people to move into disability support. And so one of the things you might do is actually work in the area. And that can it's a great part-time job while you're at university, and it can change people's lives now and in the future. As I said, I've got a spinal cord injury. I had a number of uni students help me out when I was very, very young, and it was nice to see a friendly face come through on the weekend and say, how are you? You know, what have you been up to? So it can really change lives. And as students, in terms of being allies to the disability community, you can volunteer on stuff, you can do pro bono work. As I said, we've got Maxwell, who's currently coming to do pro bono work at the Australian Human Rights Commission. But also I think it is about asking that extra question. So when you have a group, an organisation or an event, it's about really being really open about the need for providing some reasonable adjustments so everyone can turn up, asking to make sure that they have accessible facilities, making sure that when someone raises an issue of concern, whether it be personally or an organisational setting, you realise that for that person to speak up may have taken a lot of angst for that person to raise the issue, and you just try and respectfully deal with it. And if you can get those interactions to be respectful and helpful, and you can always ask that extra question, then I think you go some step as an individual to make change. And what we know is that social change takes time. It's often done at 3 levels. It's done at a societal level and an organisational level, such as the university, but also on an individual level. And everyone can do their bit to make change take place. And it's about being that sort of being willing to ask the extra question, but most importantly, to act upon the answer.
Thanks, Ben. Liz, we might go to you next.
I'd actually written down the same as Ben about volunteering in community groups assisting people with disabilities. Certainly the students that come through us who have needed assistance have been surrounded by middle-aged white women their whole life. And to change that up, like when we employ someone who may need a lab assistant or a note taker, we employ students. That may be the first time they've had someone walk alongside them to assist them that isn't 50 and looking the same, you know? So that would be amazing. More people, because I'm thinking about, you're doing your internship now, you're thinking about those areas of the community. If you can volunteer your time, just that power of being young and accessible can change a person's life and their positivity.
Thanks, Liz. That's great. Kate?
My response was a little bit more almost kind of humanistic. We need to move away from this kind of thinking and rhetoric like us and them. We are people with disabilities. You know, if there was another paradigm to look down the microscope and examine us all, we'd all have something a little bit not quite normal. So we're all in there, you know. And I approach my work often with that whole person-centred. So tuning in, listening, observing another human being and picking up on what they might need. And sometimes remember things like, you know, neurodiverse disabilities. So I've got quite a few clients with autism, and with that often comes social anxiety. So that person, to include that person as equally as possible, as fairly as possible. They might need to just bail halfway through a meeting. They might come to your party, but they might bail after 10 minutes. Allow them to do that. Allow them to have that sense of control and respect that. Yeah.
That's awesome. Such great takeaways for everyone in the audience today. So that's the end of our questions we have prepared for our panellists. Did anybody have any questions in the audience that they'd like to ask? That they're happy to put their hand up now, or whether they'd like to go through Slido if you're a bit shy. Nobody's willing to go. I'm having some difficulty accessing my computer currently. So I might just go, sorry guys, just give me 1 second.
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to run to another meeting, so I might leave Slido and the IT benefits to you all, but it's been lovely to dial in, and thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you in Perth at some point in the future and hearing about some of the changes that have occurred, and it'd be great if students could get involved in assisting people with disability, because I think it makes a really profound difference now and in the future.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ben. Thank you so much for joining me. Perfect. So we do have quite a few questions that have come in, so thanks so much, guys, for sending these through. We might just take 5 minutes if you guys are still happy to answer some questions. So the first question is, do you have any particular tips for calling out ableism? So when you hear ableist language used by others, what would you say or do in those kind of situations?
I suppose that depends how quick-witted you are, doesn't it? I always like a bit of sarcasm and just kind of throw it back at them, whoever's come out with that insulting or disrespectful comment. I don't know, I'm trying to think of...
I'm probably much more aware of things like buildings and toilets. Like, this is the most inaccessible building in the university, and that's my fault as I walk in here.
Ironic, isn't it?
So I guess probably there's things that you're constantly attuned to, but language is a hard one because it's confrontational, isn't it?
Yeah.
To actually, I guess it's like sort of rephrasing is possibly what I do, is like say it again for someone in a rephrased way.
Yeah, particularly where the situations, I guess, where it's somebody who hasn't intentionally used that as a slur, it becomes quite difficult to kind of say you've done something wrong and make them feel as though they've gravely offended someone, which may be the case, but unintentionally it becomes quite a difficult conversation.
And I think it is worth correcting.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question we've had is what is an appropriate way to ask someone about their accessibility needs? For example, when you meet someone new in the workplace, would you go ahead and ask that question, or would you wait for them to come to you?
Yes, always ask. Just ask, and we ask everyone. Yeah. You don't just ask someone because they've come in on a pair of crutches. You know, you'd ask me, you'd ask you, you'd ask whoever. Like, that's just a standard question, and then no one's left out, and that is inclusive, isn't it?
Yeah. And like I would say, do you have any cultural concerns or needs that I need to address? Do you have any accessibility areas that I need to address? Are you a carer, family? It's just a part of that whole conversation.
Perfect. So another question we've got is, what would you say is the biggest threat to the rights of people with a disability in Australia at the moment? I guess we've kind of touched on a few of them throughout the panel today. You know, the more subtle difficulties that are faced in terms of changing mindset and the social barriers that you spoke about, Liz.
I guess unemployment is still very high.
Yep.
So even though we're very privileged to live in a state with high employment, the figures for unemployment for people with disability is still very high. They track the graduate employment for students with disability is still very high. And there's a number of factors for that, because they may not have had that part-time work opportunities, and we may not have done internships and things like that. So I think employment is still an area that needs a lot of work.
Yeah. Kate, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
For me, it's the cross-section of where poverty, disability and that lack of access, I think that really needs work. There's a lot of, I'm not sure if people have heard the stats on, so under 18 Aboriginal identifying young men incarcerated is something crazy. I know that a couple of years ago it was like 76% identified as Aboriginal, and then you look at that percentage of people in Kasarina or Banksia who have FASD. FASD is a disability, so we're locking up people with disabilities who also have lingual and cultural barriers, and then we're chucking into the justice system. Once you're in there, it's pretty hard to get out. So yeah, that's a whole can of worms that needs unpicking and needs a lot of focus, I think.
Yeah. Awesome. So just probably in the interest of time, we might wrap it up there. Thank you both for taking the time to speak today. It's been incredibly valuable. I know I've learned a lot today from both you and from Dr. Gauntlet as well, from joining us online. Thanks everyone in the audience for joining us as well today. It's been great to have you all here, and thanks for all sending in your questions via Slido. Apologies we couldn't get through them all. There were some great ones in there. Just a reminder to all the McCusker interns just to register using the QR code as well. So you get your attendance registered. And thank you again to everyone for coming out. It's been fantastic. And just a quick thank you gift from the McCusker Centre for Kate and Liz as well.